terrify me as a kid. It terrified me.
Okay, one moment. Hello everybody and welcome to the Penelope Possum channel with me, your hostess Penelope the Possum. Yeah, I was gonna try something, but I don't think I get to try it today. Boop. Did you hear a boop? Was there a boop? I didn't hear a boop. Anyways. As you can see, I found another creepypasta website, just Fandom Wiki, which is just a Wikipedia. Hi! It's just a Wikipedia page for different fandom things. This one's specifically the Creepypasta Fandom Wiki. What is happening? Why is my chat turning into robots? Chat, why are you robots? Anyways. Today, we're going to be reading The World's Best Psychologist. I don't know who this is by, because it doesn't say at the top who it's by. But whatever. Now, I have heard this story read before, and I know it's a little weird. Like, it's not going to make the most sense in some areas, but it is going to be definitely very creepy. So let's get into it and let's read The World's Best Psychologist. I'm gonna read it like this because it looks better to me. World's Best School Psychologist. When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This obviously restricted my amount of play time outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over at the house, nor was I allowed to go to anyone else's. I had to finish homework straight after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. No, I didn't say it was bad. I didn't mean it was like bad weird. It was just, you'll see. You'll see as I read. Chickens, could you calm down just a little tiny bit? Thank you. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books. Write book reports to prove I actually read them. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me as a child, they weren't what upset me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty about accidents or mistakes I'd made. My father only knew one emotion, frustration. The only time he offered his attention was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school's psychologist. For his own privacy, we'll call him Dr. Tanner. Like in most junior high schools, a psychologist was always available on campus during school hours to assist any students in need of counseling, whether it was emotional, academic, social, behavior, etc. To be honest though, I'd never seen any other students talking with Dr. Tanner. Every day I'd walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's little window. He would always be in there, alone, working on some paperwork. I guessed that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to visit his office. March 2nd, 1993 was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner during lunch break. I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion for me to come inside. I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and then asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I rambled to him about how mean my parents were and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quaver and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded, head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about how everything I had just said was untrue, and that my parents loved me dearly and blah blah blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better, forever." After a brief pause, he continued, "Although I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow, and that you won't tell anyone what we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret." I decided now that I'm not going to be wearing my headphones. There's no music to be playing. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to take a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched him close the blinds of the door's tiny window. "There," he said. "Now we have all the privacy we need." We began to talk about my hobbies and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite teachers, and things that like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took the offer, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans on the desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner put in my drink. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when I did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed, my mouth sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at the cuffs, but soon gave up after. My eyes widened in disbelief and looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. I didn't know what to think. Here I was in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I probably would have cried from joy if I had not been constrained to the bed frame. My stomach sank once again as the door opened and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Now listen," he said. "Remember that I'm here to help you. That I would never hurt you, okay?" He gently removed the tape from my mouth and then the cuffs from my hands. Whoa! Okay. That was unexpected. Let's get back into some. My first instinct was to begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me. "You're going to be staying here for a while," he continued. "And during this time, you're allowed to play with anything you want in your room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch the television, but I want you to only watch the news channels when I'm away." I sat in silence, trying to process the information he'd given me. "So!" Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee. "Go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All what was left for me to do was to boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. About 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned into the room, carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in this room. "Well, about a month," he replied. "Give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do." The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. "Hey, bud, you don't have to wake up right now if you don't want to, but I'm gonna need to put this back on," he whispered, clamping the cold steel handcuff onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulder, and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me, told me to turn it on and watch the news. First thing I saw was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at a podium, surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. "A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there is not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy was last seen around 4 or 5 on the evening of..." I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook photo from last year. Captions for the photograph displayed my name, age, school, and town. Above my picture were alternating titles: FBI begins search for child, and kidnapping suspect unknown, and potential runaway. The live footage continued. 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took a hold of the microphone. I'd never seen so much emotion come from my mother before. She wept, stuttering through sentences such as, "Please, return my baby back to me," and "I'm so sorry," and "Please come back home to us." When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely, and even begged me for my forgiveness. "I know I haven't been the best father, but God damn it, do I wish I had been now. Please bring my boy back." I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed. I'd never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much. But at the same time, I was relieved. Now I knew how much my mom and dad loved me. Nearly 4 weeks had passed, and Dr. Tanner was treating me with the utmost respect. He left me in the morning, cuffed to the bed frame, but returned in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk and play games. I would have never guessed how good he was at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning, when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading off to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than when he usually woke me. "You need to watch the news today. No excuses. I want you to keep the television all day and pay close attention to it," he stated grimly. I, of course, promised to comply and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, Human Remains Found. Two staunch-looking men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. "We are displeased to share the unfortunate news this morning regarding the missing child case from earlier this month." The other man bowed his head, while the one speaking shuffled through some papers. He continued, "Remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, though not much of it is left. The body was decapitated, and much has been burnt to ash and bone." The screens shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of a tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. "Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card labeled as such." The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the two men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down to his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzy water into my hand. He put his hands on my shoulders and smiled. "I made you a promise, didn't I?" I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. "I need you to make a promise again," he whispered. He told me that I had to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep. And from there on, I was never to tell anyone that I had met him. I promised. I told you I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I? And he was right. I awoke later that night to find myself laying in the middle of a park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. I recognized where I was. It wasn't too far from my school, a mile or so down the road. I saw my house. Lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the front doorstep. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet and ran towards me, arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things changed with my family and I. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I could not ask for a more perfect ending. Every now and then, I see Dr. Tanner on campus, walking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another. But sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I will always keep my promise to him, pretend I never met him. There will forever be one question floating around in my mind. I think you know what that is. Ah, there's the crediting. Creepy Carbs. Thank you for that lovely, lovely story. That was a wonderful story. We've got plenty of time left. Does anybody want to read another creepypasta with me? How about you, Weez? Since you were so busy playing with my foot. Since you were so busy playing with my foot. Look at this. Look at this little monster. Yeah, that's you. That's you on the camera. You see yourself? Yeah, I think that was the question they mentioned at the end. I'll be right back. I'll be right back and we'll read another one. Maybe one of the more popular older ones. I'm back. But I told you, it was weird. Okay, let's go for Jeff the Killer. I remember that one not being very good initially. Maybe not. Ooh. This one looks good. Alright, let's go for this one. This is My Favorite Doll by Glow Cloud. Let's get right into it. When I was a kid, I was a huge sucker for Barbie dolls. Really, I didn't care for them like other girls did, giving them baths and cleaning them up and going to sleep with them. But I did like playing with them. I was usually playing around with the outfits, having them talk to each other, stuff like that. I possessed 15 dolls. 10 girls, 2 males, and 3 little kid Barbies who were girls too. I even named the dolls after my family members, but among the 15, the doll named Samantha, who was named after me, was my favorite. Merely because she had the fairest skin and the longest blondest hair, none of which I had to admit. That was pretty shallow, bordering on sexist of me. Apparently, I had a lot of fun with these dolls. I don't remember much, but I remember having them play out scenarios I wanted to happen to me. Like getting noticed by my crush or my brother finally getting caught eating all the cookies. It might sound lame now, but hey, when I was a kid. Anyway, I'm going to reread that. It might sound lame now, but hey, I was a kid. Anyway, my mom would always tell me, "You're always inside your room playing with those things. You should get out more and make friends, honey." But I would ignore her. I would stay in my room, in my own little world, playing with my little plastic Mattel friends. It was heaven. Until one day, I fell down the stairs. My head suffered some long-term memory loss when it hit the floor. So I couldn't remember most of my childhood after that, yes, including the dolls. I remember having them and playing with them, but apart from what my mother recounted for me, it was all a big blur. Would you stop that? My mom told me that I continued to play with my Barbie dolls, but it wasn't quite the same. Eventually, I grew up. When I reached about 10 years, these dolls were left in a box in the attic to gather dust. I wasn't too upset about it either. At that time, I had already moved on to reading Harry Potter books. One day, though, things were different. I had just finished high school and I was packing up my things to head for college. I needed to get some boxes from the attic, so I headed up the small spiral staircase and proceeded into the room. Going through the boxes, I found myself smiling reminiscently as I spotted some old stuff. Books, old toys, photo albums, and the like. I ended up staying there more than I intended to. As I reached the last few boxes, I encountered the dolls. I opened up the box only to be horrified by what I saw. For what I had found instead of my old friends was a pile of plastic naked bodies with no heads and arms. It wasn't that scary if you think about it, but it had surprised me completely since the last time I saw these dolls, which was when I put them in the box, they were all in perfect and sellable condition. Seeing them like that just tore a small hole in my heart. They had been dear to me somehow, after all. I headed down the stairs, box in my arms, and showed the dolls to my mom. "Did you let Stephen borrow these after we put them away?" I asked. My brother had just turned 10 this year, but I figured he might have gotten his hands on my dolls years ago. And maybe thought they were chew toys or something. Would you quit that? But then my mom frowned and looked through the box. "No, I know how much these dolls meant to you. I wouldn't do that." I shook my head. "But he must have gotten his hands on them. Look, they're all messed up," I countered, my eyes beginning to sting just looking at the bare bodies. But I cleared my throat and tried to pull myself together. They were just toys after all. But anyways, it's done now. Nothing I can do. I'll put this back upstairs, I decided, grabbing the box once again and heading back to the attic. Part of me was still upset that Stephen might have gotten a hold of my things, but I managed to get over it when I reached the spiral stairs. Halfway there, through some force, probably my clumsiness, tripped me over and I fell down almost 5 steps. I landed on my rear on the wooden floor and I winced in pain as the dolls poured out of the box and onto my torso. I sighed as I got up. "I'm alright," I yelled back downstairs. I'm alright, I yelled as I yelled back downstairs. If you were asking. Getting the toys off me, I stood and took a moment to check myself up. Luckily, I didn't suffer any injuries. I got down on my hands and knees and picked up the dolls, or at least what used to be dolls, to put them all back in the box. Till I noticed something odd. All the dolls were naked and missing some limbs except for one doll, Samantha. She was in perfect condition as she had always been. She was even wearing the outfit I always made her wear. A pink silk gown filled with glitters at the bottom part. She wore black stilettos and was carrying a black carry-on bag like she was going to a red carpet event. She was smiling at me. I almost smiled back. Until I saw her smile was different. Her grin was wide, almost abnormally wide, somewhat sinister. I felt chills in my spine. I headed back downstairs to tell my mom about it. She was still fixing some of my stuff for college, and I approached her reluctantly. Mom? She barely looked up, but she gestured that I go on. Can I ask you something? She smiled. Well, you already have, honey. I rolled my eyes. This was not the time to receive sassy talk from my mom. Let me ask you another, then. How did I get on with those dolls? She stopped what she was doing and looked at me, a slight frown on her eyebrows. What, honey? How did I really play with them? I asked more clearly. Her frown deepened. You mean before that? I nodded, referring to my childhood accent. It was adorable how you played with them, really, she began, taking a breath. I listened intently as she told me about having them all interact with each other, like a role play of sorts, the scenarios I wanted to happen in real life. It sounded nothing serious, but for some reason I couldn't get this uneasiness away. Okay, then. I gulped, and then after the accident. Well, we let you stop playing with them because it was starting to scare your sister, Chrissy. You started having them fight with each other physically, having them take off each other's body parts. You'd take off their clothes and set them on fire. Then you'd take off their arms and throw them around your room. You'd remove their heads and stomp on them with your foot while you laughed. You were enjoying it, Sam. She stopped, and I was glad she did. There was this one Barbie you left clean, though. The one in the pink dress, she said, going back to fixing my things. The uneasiness worked. I knew that I had Samantha play me in all my scenarios. Samantha? Yes, Samantha, she said with a nod. You would leave her clean, and then after that you would just whisper things to her. It was just plain creepy. And that was My Favorite Doll by Glow Cloud. I gotta say that wasn't exactly where I was expecting that to go. Though you can't really have too many expectations with a simple title as My Favorite Doll. I was honestly expecting some kind of haunted porcelain doll story, maybe. Yeah, we got a couple of oddballs here tonight. Me personally, I never really loved Barbie dolls. They were fine enough. I just wasn't a big doll girl, you know? I liked porcelain dolls, but you can't really play with those. They're not for playing, they're for sitting and looking pretty and all that. I just. I. Honestly, if I had to pick a doll I liked more, it was probably Polly Pocket, but that was only because I could chew on her clothes. Yeah, I was one of those weirdos who only liked Polly Pockets because you could chew on the clothes. There was one particular one I remember so vividly. It was the Cinderella set. This was when Polly Pockets were like this tall of dolls that came with bigger play sets and like the rubbery clothes. But I remember I had a Cinderella set, or one of my friends said no, I think I did. And I liked chewing on the peasant dress the most. That probably sounds completely unhinged admitting to that, but what the heck? I know I wasn't the only one. Yeah, that was very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people did the wish fulfillment angle with dolls like that, though. Playing with them just to enact scenarios they wanted to happen in real life, or make up characters and stories for them. Hi. You're very close to my face. How about we go to a different site and get another random story? I know we had that one bad call with a random story on this site, but I have faith. Let's go back here. How about we read this one? This is apparently the creepypasta of the month on this website. This will be the last creepypasta of the night, I think. Okay then. You want to stay there, okay? You having fun back there? There you go. It's a more comfortable spot for you to be. Just a few miles outside of my town stood an old country house. It had been converted into a daycare where parents would drop off their kids in the morning, pick them up in the evening. However, said daycare had been out of business for a few years now. There was a sign posted in the front yard just a few feet from the house that read, "Happy Sun Daycare," with a cute-looking cartoony sun painted on it. Within the fenced-off backyard stood playground equipment that had fallen into disrepair and begun to rust. A slide, a couple swing sets, some monkey bars, and a merry-go-round were once covered by swarms of children as they ran and played in the outdoors. They had since become perches for the local birds and squirrels and were swarmed by ants rather than children. I had decided to write a report on the Happy Sun Daycare for the news blog I worked for. For one thing, several people around today had gone to that daycare. I figured it might make for an interesting story to read about their experiences there, and if it affected their later life in any way. The other reason wasn't quite so innocent. There had always been concerned parents who would fret over leaving their child in someone else's care. It was about that constant worry about how safe their sons and daughters were, especially with all the horror stories posted online about various daycare-related tragedies. For my report, I decided I would interview both employees and people who had gone to the daycare's children. I wanted to get as many different points of view as possible so that it wouldn't seem too terribly biased. Of course, I agreed not to use real names for the sake of their privacy. The first person I interviewed was a middle-aged woman who looked after the infants at the daycare. For the sake of her privacy, we'll just call her Margaret. "What was it like working at the daycare?" I asked her. She replied, "Oh, it wasn't anything too spectacular, just your typical day of working with children, or babies in my case." "I see," I said before I asked, "Have you had any problems while working there?" She shook her head. "The babies? Of course not. They could be fussy, but they weren't any trouble at all. The children were another story." This piqued my interest. Were the children that attended Happy Sun Daycare too much for the employees to handle? Or could it be that there were cases of abuse going on that had been kept secret until now? I had to find out. "Why might that be?" I asked. "Well," Margaret paused for a second, as though she was apprehensive about speaking to me. "There were times when I heard muffled squealing. No, not squealing. Screaming. At first I thought it was just the children pretending to be scared. But the more I heard it, the more I realized those screams were real. That something was terrifying or even possibly hurting them." "Did you ever see any children get hurt?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, most of them were just the usual scrapes and bruises you'd expect to find on a child who fell while playing or bumped his head trying to show off his or her friends. Some of them seemed off to me. Every so often I'd see a child walk past on the way to the nurse's office, and each time the child looked like he had been scratched or even bitten." Children scratched or bitten? Children scratched or bitten? That would be cause for alarm for anyone. Perhaps some wild animal had decided to make its home near the daycare and curious children had gotten too close. Maybe a stray dog had wandered onto the playground and some poor unknown kid wanted to pet it. Were there any animals in the area? I decided to ask. Stray dogs, raccoons, perhaps a possum nest? I doubt it. Pets weren't allowed at daycare, and traps were set up at night to keep wildlife away. There might have been a dog roaming around the area. Margaret shook her head, pointed out, perhaps it was the dog that had bit those children. Oh, I only heard the dog, she told me. I never actually seen it. All I'd ever experienced was the occasional growl, snarl, or howl. So Margaret had only heard what sounded like a dog. I couldn't rule out the possibility that perhaps she had mistaken some noise she had heard for that of a dog. Maybe she heard some children that were only pretending to be dogs and mistook them for a real one. Maybe she heard the wind and thought it was a howl. If that were the case, it wouldn't explain the scratches and bites she'd seen on some of the children. It wasn't too out of the realm. Possibility that a child could have simply scratched their arm on a branch or part of the fence on accident. With what sounded like a dog's growl to her, Margaret could have reached the conclusion that the children were being attacked by some sort of stray canine. Still, I had to learn more about the daycare, with the possibility of a cover-up regarding a series of dog attacks. I figured the next person to interview would be a former attendee. Perhaps one of them would have childhood memories that could potentially shed some light on what Margaret had mentioned. After doing some background checks, After doing some background checks, I managed to find a young man who went to Happy Sun Daycare when he was around 5 or 6. Let's just call him Scott. I found Scott working at a local butcher's shop. I had to wait till his shift was over before I could start the interview. Luckily, it wasn't too long of a wait. It gave me time to consider what to ask him. Do you remember anything about Happy Sun Daycare? I asked. I know it was a long time ago, but perhaps you can recall something? Scott thought for a moment before replying. Not much. I was only 5 or 6 when I went. I can remember just doing what kids do at that age. Playing, finger painting, watching cartoons, that kind of stuff. I nodded. Were you a good kid? For the most part, he admitted. Occasionally I'd get into some trouble. Nothing too serious though. Just your typical kid fussiness. You know, not wanting to take naps, refusing to eat veggies, that sort of thing. I see, I replied as I wrote down what he told me on a notepad. And was the daycare fair in how they disciplined you? Yes, somewhat. All I ever got was the occasional scolding, and I misread that. Yes, somewhat. All I ever got was a scolding and the occasional time out, where they made you sit in a corner for a few minutes till they felt you were ready to join the other kids. Though you were lucky if that was all you got, Scott pointed out. What Scott said baffled me a bit. They were lucky? How? I wondered if perhaps there had been more severe punishments for the more unruly children who attended the daycare. Could there have been some more controversial form of discipline that the employees of Happy Sun Daycare used that they didn't want known to the public? I had to know. What exactly do you mean? For a brief moment, Scott gave a shudder. He seemed to have recalled something from his childhood that potentially frightened him and affected him into his adulthood as well. The kids who got into real trouble were sent to the gray door. Scott heaved a heavy sigh. I've never been there myself. I knew a few kids who had. The ones who'd get into fights or throw huge tantrums. They'd end up going into that room. I don't know what happened in there, but they'd always come out shaken, with wide eyes. A few would break down crying. Some would scream. One kid even threw up before passing out. I frowned slightly. What sort of horrors had been conducted in the room that had been nicknamed the Grey Door? Then I remembered what Margaret had told me, and I decided to check for a connection with her story and Scott's. Did the children have any scratches or bites on them? I asked. And did you hear any strange noises? He nodded. A few kids had scratches on them after they left the Grey Door, but I thought they got them before and I just didn't notice them at first. They could have tripped or something. I did hear some heavy breathing. That could have just been some kid pouncing from running around. Hard to say from sure. First, Margaret said she thought she heard a dog snarling. Now Scott was saying he heard heavy breathing. With the strange noises, mysterious scratches on misbehaving children, and the mystery of the Grey Door room, I couldn't help but wonder what it was that Happy Sun Daycare had been hiding for all these years. I thanked Scott for taking the time to speak to me before moving on to the next person in the interview. With my curiosity regarding the Grey Door still heightened, I figured the next person to speak to should be one of the more troublemaking attendees of the daycare. I had to know more about what went on inside that room. Perhaps one of them could tell me. After doing more background checks, I managed to track down a young woman whom we'll refer to as Alice. She had been arrested 2 weeks ago for spraying graffiti, charged with vandalism. Rather than spend time in jail, she agreed to do 4 months community service. From what I read about her records, this wasn't the first time she had gotten into trouble with law. Were you always this much trouble? I asked her. Alice shrugged. Maybe. I wasn't sure how easy it would be to get the answers I wanted from her. She seemed like the type who would only cooperate if she gets something out of it. Like less time behind bars. I need to know about Happy Sun Daycare, I asked her. Do you remember anything about the Grey Door? For a brief second, a hint of fear flashed in her eyes. She became pale as a few beads of sweat trickled down her forehead. That was a long time ago, Alice pointed out. I replied, surely you must remember something. Records show you were 10 when you attended. Are you sure you can't recall anything? Alice took a few deep breaths to regain her composure, as if the mere mention of the Grey Door room was enough to put the fear into her after all those years. I couldn't help but dread what horrors she could have experienced. Here was someone who had run-ins with the law, someone who had been arrested for various crimes, primarily theft, vandalism, and trespassing. And yet it was something from her childhood that caused her the most fear of being punished. Why? Okay, I'll tell you, but you gotta promise never to say that I told you anything. Got it? Alice sighed. I assured her, I won't reveal any names. That will be strictly confidential. You see, I was outside in the playground, she began to explain. I remember wanting to play on the swings. Another claimed he had already gotten first dibs to play on them. Before I knew it, we were having a big argument. I lost control. The next thing I knew, he was on the ground crying. I must have pushed him when we were arguing. One of the teachers came up and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me inside. She told me I would be taken into what the other kids called the gray door room as punishment. What was inside the room? I asked in anticipation. Alice took another deep breath and let out a shudder and a sigh. The room was mostly empty. I remember the floor was nothing but dirt ground, and the only light was a dingy old bulb that barely lit anything up. The teacher just shoved me in and slammed the door shut. At first, I tried pounding on the door and screaming. I cried out for anyone to open it. It was so dark and cold. I was so scared, and I heard something. Something was behind me. I turned around and all I remember was screaming louder than I had ever screamed in my life. I frowned in concern. What did you see? It was a dog. Or at least, I think it was a dog. She choked back a few tears. I didn't get a good look since it was so dark. All I remember it was the biggest, ugliest dog I'd ever seen. That thing had yellow glowing eyes and huge sharp teeth. It was covered in black, shaggy fur. Before I knew it, it snarled and lunged at me. I ran around as fast as I could, screaming and begging for anyone to come and save me. It grabbed onto my skirt with its teeth and tried to pull me towards it. I tripped and fell, but I managed to kick it in the face a couple times to get it to let go. Then it lunged at me again. Luckily for me, the door finally opened. One of the teachers pulled me out of the room and slammed the door shut before the dog could get me again. So there was a dog after all. The stories were all starting to come together. Margaret's story about hearing screams and growling. Scott's story about horrified kids who had been sent to the gray door room. And now there was Alice's story about being sent to that room and being attacked by some sort of large, vicious dog. I had to know more. Why did they use a dog? Why did they cover it up? Perhaps the people working at the Happy Sun daycare were afraid such a punishment would be too extreme to use on children? Or maybe they feared being sued by some animal rights group. I thanked Alice for her time and set forth to find the next person to talk to. Maybe it would be another one of the employees. If I was lucky, I might be able to get one of them to reveal the truth about what was going on in the gray dorm room. Once again, I began searching through the records of anyone who had ever worked at Happy Sun daycare. It took some time to find someone who was willing to talk to me. Most former employees I asked were either too busy or didn't want to give an interview. A few of them directed various profanities at me as well. I couldn't tell if they were angry that I learned about what was going on all those years ago, or if they were afraid of what might happen if they revealed any more secrets to me. Still, I managed to track down at least one person who was willing to tell me his experiences working at Happy Sun daycare. Mr. Smith, as we'll call him, worked as a janitor at the daycare, back when it was still running. He managed to get the job only because his aunt was in charge of one of the head offices there as well. However, Mr. Smith had moved to another town since the daycare closed years ago. This meant I couldn't interview in person. So we sent each other emails instead. Mr. Smith explained that he had been dealing with some form of narcolepsy since he was a teenager, and had a history of sleepwalking as well. Doctors couldn't figure out what was causing his condition, but they couldn't find any other adverse health effects linked to it either. This still made it difficult for him to find work, though. He told me he was grateful that his aunt managed to get him a job at Happy Sun Daycare. I had so many questions, and, well, I wasn't sure which one to ask first. After I got his first response, I wrote back to him. I wanted to know how he's able to hold his job despite his condition. Was he on medication for it? And how did the other employees and children treat him? A couple days passed before I got my response to him. I quickly opened the latest email from Mr. Smith and began to read. He replied that his aunt would mix him a special herbal tea for him that would help keep his narcolepsy in check. Apparently, she strongly believed in herbal medicine and said that it was better than any standard medicine on the market. Mr. Smith wrote about how the tea was quite bitter and how he hated drinking it, but that he had to drink it if he wanted to keep his job. Though on occasion his aunt would run out of the leaves needed for the tea and he'd end up falling asleep. This prompted another employee to go and make sure he didn't accidentally hurt himself or others. As for how the others treated him, Mr. Smith explained in his letter that the children were generally nice to them. Most of them were quite curious and would ask him lots of questions while he worked. A few would ask it as a nuisance, but he didn't recall any of them being too much trouble. On the other hand, the other employees seemed to have a sense of uneasiness around him. He explained how he felt that they seemed extremely cautious around him. He pointed out that his aunt always kept a close eye on him. He wasn't sure if this was due to his condition or some other reason, though. And here we have a picture of the dog that allegedly attacked kids at that daycare. And that just caused more questions to form in my mind. Why were the other employees so uneasy around him? Was it because he was the nephew of one of the higher-ups, or was there another reason? And there was the matter of his aunt keeping a close eye on him. Maybe they were trying to keep the whole issue regarding the gray door room a secret from him. Perhaps they were afraid that he would find out about the dog and would contact the police. I had to know if he knew anything about the room. I quickly wrote a reply and asked if he knew anything about a large empty room and children being attacked by some sort of dog. Another couple days passed before I got another response from Mr. Smith. I opened reply and began to read. He said he didn't remember any kind of dog at the daycare, In fact, he pointed out that animals weren't allowed on the property and that he would set up traps to keep the squirrels and mice out. His aunt was very strict about no pets being allowed as well. Most likely it was due to any potential allergies kids might have. Mr. Smith explained this in his reply, that perhaps the dog that Alice claimed had attacked her was just someone in a cheap-looking dog costume. That the room perhaps had been kept barely lit so that the kids in there wouldn't realize it was fake. That the scratches and bites were just a result of them tripping and accidentally scratching themselves. To my surprise, he'd been in the gray door room himself several times as well. Strangely, he pointed out that it was always when he hadn't had any tea to drink. He would wake up in the room. He wasn't sure if anyone had moved him in there so he could sleep without being in anyone's way, or if he had been sleepwalking again and just stumbled in there by mistake. Mr. Smith explained that the room was originally going to be a large storage closet for various arts and crafts related supplies, but it was never finished due to budget cuts. He wrote in his reply that his aunt didn't want the area to go to waste.
I'm about to split.
Oh, okay, hold on. I'm about to finish reading this. Right. Let me not topple over.
She scares. No, small. You're very tiny. Come on, Cheetah.
He wrote his aunt didn't want the room to go to waste, so they decided to use it as a means to punish misbehaving children. In his opinion, somebody probably bought a dog costume and would wear it while terrorizing children sent to the room as a means of instilling the fear of punishment. I sent one last email to Mr. Smith, thanking him for taking the time to reply to my messages. The whole thing about Happy Sun Daycare was just starting to come together. From what I gathered via the various interviews from both students and employees, children who misbehave were sent to a large empty space called the Grey Door Room. There was a dog, or possibly just someone in a dog costume, that would chase any child sent there. Finally, said child would be pulled to safety before the dog caused any serious harm. There was only one thing left to do. I was going to head inside Happy Sun Daycare and investigate the infamous Grey Door Room for myself. I had to see for myself if there was anything that could solve this strange cover-up. Several minutes passed as I drove out to the countryside towards the abandoned building. I parked the car in front of the driveway and took a few deep breaths. The front door was unlocked, which was lucky for me. I gently pushed it open and began to look inside. The interior was dingy and covered in a layer of dust. Cobwebs spread over various desks and chairs that hadn't been used in quite some time. A musty smell filled the house and mixed with the odor of feces and urine from the rats that now made the place their home. It was nauseating, to say the least. After I explored several different areas, I soon found the foreboding grey door that was said to lead to the dreaded room. The door was quite heavy. It took me several tries, but I managed to force it open. Just like how Alice had described, the room was dark and empty, with a dirt floor and dingy bulb. Said bulb had burned out long ago, so I used an old desk to prop the door open in order to see anything. I could see faint bloodstains on the ground and wall. I couldn't tell who or what the blood belonged to. There were strange markings on the wall as well. I took a closer look. I could have sworn they resembled claw marks of some sort. As I continued to examine the room, I noticed various footprints in the dirt. Many were faded or had been trampled on over one another, but I could still make out a few. Most of them were footprints of children. They looked like their makers had been running away from something. There was one other distinct set of footprints that caught my attention. I examined them closely. I could definitely make out the distinctive footpads, claws, and individual toes on at least one set of prints, and that this wasn't some person in a cheap costume. Happy Sun Daycare had been using a dog to terrorize children. I had to let people know what they had been hiding for all those years. However, as I made my way out of the daycare into my car, there was one aspect about those footprints that made me uneasy. Since when did dogs walk on two legs? And that was Happy Sun Daycare by Chelsea Adams 542.
See you in the morning.
See you in the morning, hon.
Love you.
Love you more. Ooh. I gotta say, that was crazy. I think what was happening there is that the narcoleptic janitor was actually a narcoleptic werewolf janitor. I swear I've read this story before or heard it read before. I cannot fully remember though. It seems way too similar to something I've heard of, read to me, or maybe heard in a dream. Yeah, janitor was a werewolf, 110%, and they decided to use his werewolfism to terrorize the kids. Oh my god, that means the kids that got bitten are definitely werewolves now. Like, think about it. Scott, from before, said he saw kids walking out with bite marks. Bite marks, guys. That means those kids are werewolves. Werewolves. You know, I don't see a lot of werewolf horror anymore. I feel like there isn't a lot of directions you can go with werewolves. Like, with vampires, there's some wiggle room in what you can do with them. With zombies, it's fair game. You can do whatever you want. With werewolves, they're kind of set into a certain mold, I feel. Also, I want to know, how come there hasn't been a horror movie about Santa and his elves specifically? Like, there's plenty of horror movies about Krampus and other creepy tellings of holiday stories, but Santa himself is creepy. And what about the elves? Oh, your dryer's still under warranty, you think? You might want to double check that just in case it breaks down. Anyways, that'll be it for tonight. Thank you all for joining me here tonight. Sooner or later, I'm gonna get me a little something that I can use for fun voices I can do. Well, more fun voices I can do for reading creepypastas and online games and whatnot, because it's easier not to play as a girl while you're playing a game. It really is. Anyways, thank you. Thank you all for joining me here tonight. Please remember, as always, to stay out of small spaces that you could get trapped in. Stay out of car engine compartments. Stay out of traffic. Stay hydrated. Stay awesome, possums. Have a good time, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Good night. This is Possum signing off.